So, what do you want to explain us today, Alex?
Today we have chosen both of us to talk about something that's very important nowadays, and that is called NATO.
Okay, is it NATO or NATO?
As you want, but because you know French, for instance, they call it OTAN. It's a palindrome, I think you call that like that. You have the same letters in the other way.
OTAN.
OTAN, and I think there are two names. You have the French version or the English version. You don't have any other alternative.
Okay, but what is this NATO? Is it like something United Nations?
Well, I think a lot of people can mistake it with the United Nations, since we can consider it like a group of states first, or kind of an alliance. But it's very different because it's very based on defense. NATO means the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it's very different from the UN because UN is more global and NATO is more geographically separated.
North Atlantic, where is it?
So you know the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
So like there is this link that has been famous in history, like the transatlantic link between North America and Europe, and so it's where the story of NATO starts.
Okay, then cutting to the chase, does it mean if a country is out of that region that is mentioned in the name, that they cannot be part of NATO?
It depends. If you look at the funding countries, you have only two countries that are not part of Europe, and they are the United States and Canada. The other countries are all part of the European continent. You have the UK, you have France, you have Italy, you have Portugal, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland. So you have 12 funding countries on security basis and the collective defense system. I think also an important point to mention is that NATO doesn't have, let's say, a NATO army. It doesn't exist. Like, you don't have an helmet written NATO. NATO is made of the 30 armies of the member countries.
30 members. The number of members increased.
Exactly. From 1949 to nowadays, there have been new adhesions of countries.
Greece, or even smaller ones, Romania. What kind of protection do they get?
So like the foundations of NATO are to find, especially in Article 5. If an attacker is going to attack members of NATO, then the 29 other members of NATO will have the right to replicate and to engage into a conflict. So it's a very big security for the smallest countries of NATO. If you have one of the smallest countries of NATO is probably North Macedonia is attacked, then it means that the US can get involved and help North Macedonia to solve the conflict. It's a very, very big insurance because it's collective defense. That's the main word, like you have a collective defense. All the members are supposed to contribute fairly and equally to the budget of NATO. And the budget of NATO is made of the additions of the different military expenses of the countries that are fully members of NATO.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, who is paying for all those operations?
It's always good to know who is paying behind it. It's us, taxpayers. The budget of NATO comes from national budgets, and we contribute to make the budget of our states. Contributions of countries to NATO is equivalent to their GDP. Considering that the United States has the biggest GDP, it's logical that they contribute more because it's a percentage of their GDP. And what the United States want to say is like, okay, if you all countries contribute to like 2% of your GDP to defense, so the military expenses, then it's quite fair because we all have the same proportion. But you know that 2% of the GDP of the US is not going to be equivalent to 2% of the GDP of Albania, that is also part of the NATO.
So US pays how much? What's the weight?
What do you think?
I don't know, at least 50%.
Yeah, close to 70%.
Okay, so NATO equal to US. It's like a US army shaped in a different way. Like renamed the US army.
The US/NATO. It's fair to say that, yeah, the US is like driving NATO if we take it from the perspective of the budget. So you have 70% of the US, which is equivalent more or less to 800 billion US dollars. It means that countries from Europe, they will contribute to 30%. And among those 30%, you have three countries, the UK, Germany and France, that make more than the half of these European countries' contributions.
And if you have to cut to the chase, so?
If you put away the US, France, the UK and Germany, so it's only 4 members over 30, but you will lose 85% of the budget or 90% of the NATO's budget.
To me, it seems like very logical for those small countries to join NATO. They are gonna have really big and very strong protection while not paying so much. Have there been cases where a member was attacked and they had to combine and retaliate?
I think the most famous example we can get is 9/11, an attack on the US soil, so against Americans. A NATO member was attacked and then they had the right to replicate. We won't remake the story, but the attackers were Al-Qaeda and they were based in Afghanistan at this time before Osama bin Laden to fly away. So NATO coalition decided to go in Afghanistan and to make some missions there.
So in Afghanistan, it was the NATO army rather than just US army. For me, also, I think for a lot of people, it was the US.
You're very right. So for instance, when the US, they fled Afghanistan in August 2021, it was the end of the US presence in Afghanistan, but more generally of NATO official presence.
So Russia is also in Europe. Does it mean that Russia can be part of NATO? Because what I see in the news or in the TV, that Russia is against NATO.
Do you consider Russia to be in Europe?
Maybe like it has some part in Europe, so that's why I thought maybe. Also, they play in European League.
Yeah, that's true.
European what? European Cup.
Yeah,
European
the
Cup.
European Championship that happened last time, and Italy won, but we don't have to mention that. Historically, Russia is the state that succeeded to the USSR, and during the Cold War, you had this opposition between the USSR and the US. It's during this opposition that NATO came up, and also another organization from the Russian side, what we could call today Russian, but the Soviet side, that was the Warsaw Pact.
Okay.
So it started from there. There were like those two organizations that started to protect the countries that were part of this alliance.
Okay, so NATO was established after World War II.
Yep.
Against the USSR.
So NATO was created in 1949. You had this policy from the United States that was called the containment. Basically, it meant that the United States and their allies wanted to prevent the spread of communism. That was the main ideology of the USSR and its allies. They thought that maybe NATO could solve this problem by reuniting United States, Canada, and 10 other European countries, and that's what they did by signing the Washington Treaty and starting the NATO. It was also a time of instability. You had two big superpowers, United States and USSR. People were also scared that nuclear war could happen, because especially after the Second World War in the 50s, USSR, they made some nuclear tests. The Americans, they knew that they had this weapon that could, if both sides were using it, just destroy the whole planet. It started like that, to create an alliance, to also avoid that both sides could directly affront each other, to preserve their own areas and spheres of influence.
But like today, USSR doesn't exist anymore. First of all, Warsaw Pact, does it still exist?
So the Warsaw Pact does not exist anymore.
But why NATO exists?
So the Warsaw Pact was created after NATO. So it was 1955, so 6 years after the Washington Treaty establishing NATO. With the fall of USSR, officially in 1991, the Warsaw Pact was also dismantled. A period of instability in Europe. You had different needs at that moment. One of the most important was a security need. And like the former republics of the USSR, they were becoming autonomous, and so they didn't have like much, for instance, strength, neither an army capable of defending themselves. And at this moment also started for a lot of them like some democratic transitions. When you look at the Baltic republics, they wanted to have more security, and that's why in the 1990s, you have like those former republics of the USSR that became members of the NATO to find more stability.
Okay, other than Afghanistan, are there any examples of NATO holding some missions elsewhere?
The first big one was in 1995 in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Then you had another one in 1999 in Kosovo, and then you had the one in Afghanistan, and more recently in Libya. The one in Kosovo against the Serbian armies of Milosevic. A lot of contradictions happened during these missions because there have been some civilian casualties. They did aerial bombings, but without any UN mandates. They didn't have formally the right enshrined by international law to intervene. They called it humanitarian intervention.
Okay, they were conducting some missions within the borders of countries that were not part of NATO.
Yes, exactly.
From all those things, NATO sounds like an institution with very good intentions, always chasing the peace, like would never do any harm to anyone. But like, if it's like that, then why Russia is so attentive?
Normally, NATO, they cannot intervene if the conditions are not met that are set in the Washington Treaty. If a member has not been attacked, normally they cannot intervene. After the fall of USSR, like this kind of changed. The borders were really moving at that moment. So what they decided to do sometimes is to intervene in a country that has not been attacked before, but just as a preemptive move to protect the borders, to protect the area around it. And it goes directly to the Russian question, because Russia is worried of NATO going at the borders of Russia. If you consider that Russia also thinks itself as the successor of the giant sphere of influence that they used to enjoy. And what Russia has seen is that you had the Baltic republics that were part of the Soviet Union, you had also countries closer, like Romania, Bulgaria, etc., that also joined NATO. You have countries that had aspirations to join European Union, to adhere to some democratic values, and also to join alliance that is NATO. For instance, Ukraine, they had been in the Russian sphere of influence for ages, and so Russia won't like to see Ukraine going on the other side, going on the NATO side. So Russia is very worried about NATO for that. They know that if NATO is going at their doorsteps, well, maybe it could endanger also their stability and the system that they have been promoting for years, like an autocratic system. They know that revolutions, they also start in a country when countries that are around are moving to another direction.
As we are recording this video, there is this big tension between Russia and Ukraine. Russia thinks that Ukraine is just a puppet of Western powers, and Western powers are discussing maybe to draw Ukraine a bit more on their own side. But seems like Russia is also worried about that. So in general, what is going on?
So what's going on between like NATO, Ukraine and Russia?
Yes.
So you have Ukraine here, you have Russia there, and here you have like NATO. Ukraine is at a crucial point between one alliance and another. There have been tensions in Ukraine for now like 8 years, because the real tension with Ukraine started in 2014. Officially, because 2014 is the moment where Russia decided to annex Crimea, which is a southern region of Ukraine. It's important to say that the majority of Ukrainians, they are looking on the other side, not on Russia. They are looking to NATO, to the European Union. They defend democratic values, etc. You have the famous Euromaidan, where a lot of Ukrainians, they went in Kiev to demonstrate and to express their pro-European sentiments. Putin was really worried about the moves of Ukraine. Russia has also considered forever Ukraine as part of a war that has been the USSR, but before that the Rus, which is like the people that have lived in these regions. And it's a very big history. We won't have time to go through that, but originally you have like these people called the Rus and Ukraine and Russian, so they were at the beginning kind of the same group of people. And so that's the justification also of Russia.
To me, it sounds like if you're not part of NATO, you should find a way to get along with Russia, because otherwise they will find historical reasons, or they will make a referendum in part of your country, or they will call it a peacekeeping mission, like in the example of South Caucasus, and they will somehow enter the country with their whole army. NATO doesn't seem useful or doesn't seem functioning when it comes to those gray zones.
I think that also there is something that happened in 1990 that is important to take into consideration. So if we just come back in 1990, we are still in the Cold War. 1 year before, you had the Berlin Wall that fell, and 1 year after, you will have the fall of USSR. So it was an in-between period. You had like Gorbachev, the leader of the USSR, and there was a conversation that happened between him and the former US secretary of that time. And there was a discussion about not expanding NATO in case of the German reunification, because the US, they were pushing for the German reunification. The Russians today, they think that the US made a promise to Gorbachev to not expand NATO if Gorbachev was accepting the reunification. Putin, he always said, look, like they made us some promises and they didn't respect it. And of course, if it was true and trained in the text, it would be bad, but it's not the case. This statement has never been enshrined in any treaty or any official text. It's only an oral statement. You have also to take into consideration that we are in 1990. USSR is still a big union of socialist republics, and on the other side you have still the US and their allies. After, you have the fall of USSR with a lot of instability, and you can understand that the visions also changed. New countries appearing with difficulties maybe to survive. They had not experimented such an experience before, and so they were looking for one side or the other. And at this moment, USSR was dismantled, that they looked on the other side, on the NATO side. Gorbachev, he was really looking to the West to build partnerships. And then you had Yeltsin, that was a bit, let's say, less open than Gorbachev, but still willing to talk with the West. And Putin, he has also lived with this history of seeing the USSR collapsing, the poverty coming, etc. He was a former also agent of the KGB, which is not the FSB. He had always got this narrative that the West had cheated the USSR and that it collapsed because of the US, etc. History has demonstrated that it's more complicated than just the United States.
But anyway, so far it sounds like Russia alone is trying to fight against NATO. Do they have anything similar to NATO? Did they establish after the USSR? Something like that?
If you take Russia alone against NATO, Russia is very in trouble. If you look at the military expenses of Russia, it's less than 5% of the total budget of NATO. It's like $60 billion. And
the other one is 1 trillion.
Yeah, it's 1.15 trillion US dollar. 1.15 trillion.
1.15. Okay, so a little bit more than 1 trillion.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, I'm not a math specialist, I know that.
Okay, come on, Alex, cut to the chase.
That's why Russia tried to, let's say, prepare another strategy. In 2001, they created the so-called Shanghai Cooperation. As you can imagine, Shanghai Cooperation means first a relation with China. So you have Russia and China and 6 other members that are India, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. So the Shanghai Cooperation, they don't have the same system that NATO has regarding the Article 5, the mutual assistance and collective defense.
Is Japan part of NATO?
So Japan is not a member of NATO. Japan is a partner members of NATO. As we said, normally it's limited to the geographical area of Europe, except Canada and US. But you have also partners. And Japan is one of them, but you have also, for instance, Australia, Azerbaijan, Mauritania. So you have this mix that makes NATO looking at the full members and the partners as a very global organization. One point also to take into consideration is that Russia has been involved in some NATO works, let's say, because as surprising as it can sound, Russia is also a partner country of NATO.
Then if Russia is partner countries in NATO, this partnership doesn't mean anything.
So the partnership, it's called the PFP, it's the Partnership for Peace. And so what NATO did is that they involved 20 countries in this specific partnership that are not usually on the west side. So you have Russia, but you have also Belarus, for instance. It's the same packaging. The idea is to build relations with those countries, trying to improve the links, to have some communication tools rather than just no diplomatic relations at all. As we started with, we said the US has an important part in NATO. What we are seeing now is that some European countries, they also say, okay, it's an alliance that has a lot of US influence, so maybe it would be good for us to take more independence and autonomy. This discourse is the one of the European Union and especially of some countries like France. Macron in 2019, he said that NATO was in a state of cerebral death. And in his point of view, like France should establish with the European Union more autonomy regarding this US influence to be able to make their own decisions. Maybe the future will be a European Union more able to defend and act by itself rather than being considered by the detractors of NATO as a puppet of the United States.
Okay. Let's hope for the best.
So, do you know now more about NATO? Is it more clear to you what NATO is about?
Yes. Now I am glad that NATO exists, to be honest. Okay, I am sure there are a lot of criticizing against the US, against NATO in general, but it sounds like it's a good thing that it exists, because I don't want to live in a world where there are powers, like today's Russia, but there is nothing in front of it. But I like the idea where there is, in the opposite side, there is an institution that is much stronger than all those powers that we consider evil. It gives you the feeling of safety. But still, I am not sure about the strength of NATO. I don't know if they are in the ideal level that they can protect actually everyone who needs protection. I am still not convinced that they can protect those that what we call gray zone countries from Russia if Russia decides to do something. I think that would be the top that NATO can reach, where it can protect whoever wants or asks for protection. Okay, you did the quite good research. You seemed really ready.
Yeah, I hope you get better what NATO is about.
Yeah, man. I actually learned. I mean, up until this point, I would think that I know NATO, but like I actually learned a lot of things as well. Thank you.
And thanks to you for your excellent question, Rasim. Was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.